the physiology portion for the study guide of final exam guide. This number 21. You can go ahead and pause this video or just follow along, and we'll make that a bit more easier. So the delivery of oxygen to an active muscle cell, or basically the delivery of oxygen during exercise. That's all that is. We have to make sure we have a diagram and discuss in essay form. Make sure to speak about these areas. We'll make that easier by using this diagram here. So I know this graph here is a little bit intimidating, but we'll make that much easier using this method here. So we have the ATM machine game and the ATM machine game here. This is during resting, this is during exercising. Basically, what this says is that during resting, you could think about it like you have 4 quarters or 4 tokens. So you start with O2 saturation of 4 tokens, almost 100%. And then in the arterial blood, once you reach the tissues, though, you have to pay the machine 25 cents or 1 token, right? So that's the unloading of oxygen to the tissues. So to re-summarize, we go to the mixed venous blood, and it's basically it adds up. We started with 4 tokens. We give, I guess you could say 25% or 1 token to the tissues of oxygen, and then we start and we re-summarize with O2 saturation being 75 cents, or we have left over 3 tokens. During exercise, though, it's a little bit different. We have a bit of a scenario that's going on here. Again, the ATM machine, we have starting off with O2 saturation is let's say 4 quarters or 4 tokens. And then once from the arterial blood, once we reach the tissues, we have to unload 75%, or we have to feed the machine 3 tokens. And then we reach the mixed venous blood. To re-summarize, we have an O2 saturation of 25 cents or 1 token. That makes sense because we started out with 4 tokens. We inserted 3 tokens because this is during exercising, so the tissues demand more oxygen. So 4 tokens, we insert 3 tokens into the tissues. We are left over with 25 cents or 1 token in the mixed venous blood. The partial pressure of the oxygen is 100 millimeters. It makes sense that the tissues are very demanding, so we lose and we have less than 40 millimeters of mercury of partial pressure of oxygen. And then here is the same, so these are the same, so this is pretty much helpful. Okay, now this area of the graph will help us distinguish what a right shift and a left shift means. So because this essay particularly talks about exercising, let's go ahead and move on to the right shift. It basically means how the hemoglobin has low affinity to oxygen in basically 5 scenarios. You could think of cadets. Hemoglobin has low affinity to oxygen, or low affinity meaning it lets go of the oxygen. If these demands are met, if the body has an increase of CO2 or carbon dioxide, if it has an increase of acidity of pH, so like an acidity in blood, you could say. So Ca, and then D is actually for 2,3-DPG. This is just an extra plus there. So, and then if we have an increase in exercising or an increase in temperature, we will release more oxygen than usual. So so this is a diagram for exercising, but this could be exchanged for carbon dioxide. It could be exchanged for temperature. Use cadet. So for an increase in CO2, an increase in acidity, and an increase in 2,3-DPG, an increase in exercise, an increase in temperature. This works. Okay. So now moving on. Delivery of O2 to an active muscle cell, or delivery of O2 during exercise. We need to talk about ventilation, gas exchange, transport in the blood, movement of O2 from the capillaries to the muscle cell, and what physiological adjustments basically function to increase the rate of O2 delivery to the muscle during exercise. Okay, using the negative feedback, we'll go ahead and write the variable increase in metabolic rate, by exercising will cause low PO2 or low oxygen high CO2 and low pH. The sensory section will include the medulla oblongata. The peripheral chemoreceptors and the carotid bodies, though, are sensitive to low PO2. So this increases the central response of CO2. The central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata are sensitive to high concentrations of H pluses. Okay. Now the integrating center is the medulla oblongata again. The effectors are the respiratory muscles contract via the phrenic nerve, and the response is that the ventilation will go up by the increase of respiratory rate. Respiratory rate is another word for meaning breath. How many breaths per minute? So usually we have 12 breaths per minute, and then also increasing the tidal volume, which is just the volume per breath of inspiration and expiration. Using this method, we will then have a negative feedback of increasing the O2 and then also decreasing the CO2. Now to put that in essay form, and this section here would take care of what physiological adjustments function to increase the rate of O2 delivery to the muscle during exercise. So that takes care of this, the negative feedback. Now to take care of these areas, we'll have an essay form, and we'll put 1, 2, 3, 4 next to them. We'll have 1. Ventilation occurs when environmental air exchanges into the lungs. 2. Gas exchange of O2 between pulmonary alveolar epithelium and the pulmonary capillary endothelium, or through the respiratory membrane. That's just another word for through the gas exchange. 3. The transport of blood is dependent on the concentration of hemoglobin in the blood. The hemi group, basically aids with the binding of oxygen. Okay, so now moving on. 4. Movement of oxygen from the capillaries to the muscle cell is directly dependent by the affinity of hemoglobins to O2 at rest or during exercising. That makes sense because again, we use the top chart, remember the tokens, to speak about this. And we'll continue on speaking about it. During exercise, the arterial blood has about 100 millimeters of mercury of PO2, and it has an oxygen saturation of about 98%. Although once it reaches the demanding tissues or the active muscle cells, the PO2 drops below 40 millimeters of mercury, and the O2 unloads into the tissues about 75% worth, leaving behind 25% of oxygen saturation. Affinity of the hemoglobin to the O2 moves to the right, meaning low affinity of the hemoglobin to the O2 is dependent on the high levels of CO2, acidity of pH, 2-3 dPg, exercise, and temperature. Just recall, think, cat it. Finally, the mixed venous blood has a partial pressure of O2 below 40 millimeters of mercury and a saturation of O2 below or at 25%. So this is discussed here and using this diagram here. All right, guys, take care.